At my wedding, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Soft lights, crystal glasses, a room full of people smiling like they were witnesses to something perfect. I was adjusting my veil near the bar when I saw it. My father-in-law's hand reflected in the polished metal tray behind me. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my drink. I watched him slip something into my glass. Small, clear, quick, like he'd done it before. I didn't gasp. I didn't scream. I didn't ruin my own wedding by panicking. I waited until he turned away. Then I calmly reached out and switched our glasses. Across the room, he lifted the flute I had been meant to drink from and caught my eye. His smile was confident, almost amused, as if the night was already under his control. When he stood up to raise a toast, I smiled back because in that moment, I knew the celebration everyone was expecting was over and the real wedding drama was just beginning. My name is Grace. And until that night, I believed the hardest part of my wedding would be surviving the speeches. The reception was held at a lakeside estate just outside the city. The kind of place that smells like money and tradition. Everything had been chosen by Evan's parents. Every flower, every chair, every detail that quietly reminded me this was their world, and I was only being allowed into it. Evan squeezed my hand as we were announced as husband and wife. His smile was pure, unguarded. I loved him for that. He still believed that love was enough to smooth over history. His mother, Diane, embraced me first. Her hug was careful, as if I might wrinkle her dress. "You look lovely, Grace," she said, already pulling away. Then his father stepped forward. Richard Caldwell didn't rush. He never did. He was tall, composed, silver-haired, wearing the kind of calm confidence that comes from decades of being obeyed. When he kissed my cheek, his voice was low and pleasant. "Welcome to the family." Most people would have heard warmth in that sentence. I heard ownership. Richard was a prominent attorney, well-known, well-connected, people deferred to him automatically. Waiters straightened when he spoke. Guests laughed a little too hard at his jokes. Even Evan, my brilliant, kind, thoughtful Evan, still unconsciously sought his approval. I had noticed it long before the wedding, the subtle corrections, the pointed questions about my background, the way Richard liked to remind me that the Caldwells handled their problems privately. 6 months earlier, he had invited me to lunch alone. No, Evan, no Diane, just us and a quiet table in an expensive restaurant. He'd smiled politely and said, "Grace, you seem intelligent. So, let me be clear. This family survives because we control the narrative." I hadn't understood then how far he was willing to go to keep that control. Standing in that reception hall, champagne bubbling nearby, I finally did. 6 months before the wedding, Richard asked me to meet him for lunch. He said he wanted to clear the air. I told Evan about it and he laughed, rolling his eyes like his father was just being dramatic again. "He probably just wants to give you the family speech," Evan said. Don't worry, so I didn't. The restaurant Richard chose was quiet and expensive. The kind where the servers know when not to interrupt. He arrived early, already seated, already in control. When I sat down, he didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the wedding plans. He asked, "Do you understand how fragile reputations are?" I blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." He folded his napkin carefully, like this was a lesson he'd taught many times before. People like us don't survive scandals. We prevent them. Then he slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check. $50,000. My breath caught. "What is this?" "A solution," he said calmly. "You walk away quietly. No drama, no embarrassment. Evan will be upset, but he'll recover. He always does." I pushed the envelope back toward him, my hands steady, even though my heart was racing. "I love your son." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Love doesn't protect you in this family, Grace. Silence does." I stood up, my legs trembling as I reached for my bag. "I'm not leaving." He watched me the way a man watches a door close on a problem he hasn't finished solving. As I walked out, he said softly, "Then don't say I didn't warn you." At the time, I thought he meant pressure, gossip, maybe emotional manipulation. I didn't realize he meant escalation, and I definitely didn't realize that warning would come true. On my wedding day, back at the reception, I took my seat beside Evan with a smile practiced enough to fool the room. My heart was steady now, not calm steady. There's a difference. Calm is ignorance. Steady is readiness. Evan leaned in close, his voice warm. "You okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," I said, squeezing his hand. "Just overwhelmed." That part was true. I was overwhelmed by how normal everything still looked. Laughter drifted across the tables. Glasses clinked. Someone's aunt was already crying over the first dance. No one noticed that 10 feet away, my father-in-law was holding a glass that was never meant for him. Richard sat across from us, relaxed, confident. He lifted the champagne flute slightly, watching the bubbles rise like he was admiring his own reflection. When his eyes met mine, his expression sharpened for just a second. He knew something was off. Then he stood. The room responded instantly. Conversations faded. Chairs angled toward him. Richard Caldwell didn't need to ask for attention. He expected it and people gave it willingly. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you for being here to celebrate Evan and Grace." My name sounded strange in his mouth. "This day," he continued, "is about family, about trust, about knowing that the people closest to you have your best interests at heart." A few guests nodded. Someone chuckled softly. Evan smiled proud. He still didn't see it. He still believed his father was just giving a speech. Richard raised the glass higher. The glass I had switched. I felt the room hold its breath. "To new beginnings," Richard said. He tipped the glass back and drank. I watched him swallow. Once, twice. Then he lowered the flute and smiled like a man who thought he'd already won. I lifted my water and took a slow sip, my eyes never leaving his face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his smile faltered just slightly, and that was when I knew the night was no longer under his control. At first, Richard only shifted in his chair. It was subtle, something only a person watching him closely would notice. He adjusted his cuff links, then his tie, as if the room had suddenly grown too warm. Diane leaned toward him, whispering something I couldn't hear. He waved her off with a tight smile. I counted silently. Not seconds yet, just patterns. Richard was a man who prided himself on control. He controlled rooms with his voice, meetings with his presence, people with their fear of disappointing him. So when his body began to betray him, he didn't panic. He tried to manage it. He cleared his throat once, then again. The second time was sharper, more urgent. A few guests glanced over, curiosity flickering across their faces. Richard noticed and straightened immediately, forcing a laugh. "Excuse me," he said, standing a little too fast. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Evan turned toward him. "Dad, I'm fine," Richard said, but his voice sounded strained, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. He took one step away from the table, then another. His hand reached out, gripping the edge of a chair as if to steady himself. The movement drew more attention now. Conversations paused. The music seemed suddenly too loud, then too quiet. Diane stood abruptly. "Richard, sit down." He didn't, his breathing had changed shorter. Uneven, not dramatic, not violent, just wrong. The confidence in his posture cracked, and for the first time since I'd known him, Richard Caldwell looked unsure. Madison raised her phone, whispering, "What's happening?" Evan stood up fully now, concern etched across his face. "Dad, do you need help?" Richard's eyes flicked to me. In them, I saw recognition bloom into realization. He knew. His jaw tightened. And for a brief, dangerous moment, I thought he might say something, accuse me, expose everything right there. But the room was watching. And Richard had spent his entire life avoiding scenes he couldn't control. So he swallowed it literally and figuratively. "Just give me a moment," he muttered. But his legs betrayed him. He stumbled, catching himself on the table, rattling glasses and drawing a collective gasp from the guests. That was when the illusion finally broke. This wasn't a man stepping away for fresh air. This was a man losing control in public. And as people rushed toward him, I stayed exactly where I was, calm. Still, watching the consequences of a choice he had made long before tonight, because whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just my wedding. It was the beginning of the truth coming out. The staff moved quickly, trained smiles replaced by professional urgency. Someone called for medical help. Someone else lowered the music. The room buzzed with confused concern, the kind that feeds on uncertainty. Richard was guided toward a side lounge near the reception hall. Diane clinging to his arm like she could physically hold his authority together. Evan followed instinctively, his surgeon's calm trying to take over where his son's panic began. I stood up then, not rushed, not shaking, just deliberate. Because while everyone's attention was fixed on Richard's unsteady breathing and Diane's theatrical worry, something small and quiet happened, something no one else noticed. As Richard sat down heavily on the couch, his jacket shifted. From the inside pocket slipped a folded piece of thick cream-colored paper. It floated to the floor near his polished shoes. I bent down and picked it up before a single foot could step on it. The paper was expensive, embossed, formal. My stomach tightened. This wasn't an accident. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't notes for a toast. It wasn't a medical list. It was a speech written in advance, typed, edited, polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must apologize for the disruption. Grace has been under significant stress leading up to the wedding. Unfortunately, alcohol can trigger episodes. We are deeply concerned and will make sure she gets the help she needs." My hands went cold. He hadn't just planned to make me unwell. He had planned to rewrite who I was in front of everyone I loved. To turn concern into suspicion, to turn a wedding into a warning about me. "Grace." Evan's voice cut through my thoughts. "What is that?" I looked up. His eyes were searching my face, already sensing the shift. "Read it," I said quietly, holding the paper out to him. He took it, scanning the words once, then again. I watched something inside him break, not loudly, not violently, but completely. That's not possible," Evan said, his voice hollow. Richard looked up sharply. "Evan, give me that." Evan stepped back. "Dad," he said slowly. "Why did you have this prepared?" Richard swallowed, his composure cracking further. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect you by humiliating my wife." Evan shot back. Diane stepped in, her voice sharp. "Grace, this is not the time." I cut her off, still calm. "Then when would be a better time? Before or after I was blamed for something your husband planned?" The room fell silent. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, burning with a mix of fury and fear. And in that moment, I realized something deeply unsettling. He never thought he'd need to hide this paper because he never thought he'd be caught. What Richard hadn't planned for, what men like him never planned for, was evidence. And I wasn't finished yet. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their calm efficiency cutting through the tension like a blade. Richard was guided onto a chair, questions asked, vitals checked. Diane hovered, answering for him whenever she could. Her voice too loud, too insistent. Evan didn't take his eyes off his father. Neither did I. While the paramedics worked, I felt my phone vibrate in my hand. A reply. The venue manager. I had sent a message earlier quietly, carefully asking for the security footage from the bar area. I knew the cameras were there. High-end venues always have them. Discretion costs money, but evidence costs less. I opened the file. There he was. Richard glancing around. Richard reaching into his pocket. Richard tipping something into my glass. Clear, undeniable, time-stamped. I stepped closer to Evan and turned the screen toward him. He watched without blinking. When the video ended, he didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the paramedic. My father didn't have a medical episode, Evan said, his voice steady and unfamiliar. He ingested something that wasn't meant for him. Diane's head snapped around. Evan, stop this. You're exhausted. You're confused. I'm not, he replied. The lead paramedic frowned. Sir, we'll need to notify the authorities. Yes, Evan said immediately. Please do. Diane grabbed his arm. You cannot do this. Do you know what this will do to our family? Evan gently pulled his arm free. I know what it almost did to my wife. When the police arrived, the reception was officially over. Guests were escorted out quietly, whispers following them like shadows. My parents stood close to me, frightened but proud. My mother's hand resting firmly on my back. An officer introduced himself and asked me to explain what happened. So, I did. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I told the truth the way I'd learned to tell it at work, clearly chronologically. Supported by evidence, the switched glasses, the prepared speech, the video footage. The officer nodded as he took notes. Ma'am, given what you've described, we can file an immediate report and request protective measures. I looked at Evan. He nodded. Once. Yes, I said. I want everything documented. Diane let out a sound somewhere between disbelief and rage. Grace, you're destroying us. I met her eyes, my voice quiet but unshaking. No, I'm protecting myself. As Richard was escorted out for further questioning, he finally looked at me, not with confidence, not with superiority, but with something closer to disbelief, as if he still couldn't understand how a woman like me had turned his private plan into a public record. And that's when I understood something important. Power only works in silence. The moment the truth is written down, time-stamped, and witnessed, it stops being theirs to control. The police station smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The kind of place where emotions don't echo, they settle. I sat beside Evan on a hard plastic chair. My wedding dress gathered awkwardly around me. A reminder that this day had split itself cleanly in two. Across the room, Diane paced. She kept checking her phone, making calls that went unanswered, her voice sharp with entitlement. Every few minutes, she glanced at Evan as if daring him to step in and fix this the way he always had. Richard was in another room. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the absence of his control like a vacuum. An officer approached us with paperwork. Mr. Caldwell, he said to Evan, we'll need to know if you're willing to make a statement. Evan didn't hesitate. I am. Diane spun around. Evan, you don't have to do this. He's your father. Evan stood slowly. When he spoke, his voice wasn't raised, but it carried. I know exactly who he is, he said. That's why I'm doing this. She stared at him like he'd betrayed something sacred. After everything we've given you, he shook his head. Love isn't something you trade for silence. Then he turned to me. His eyes softened, but his resolve didn't. I should have protected you sooner. I won't make that mistake again. The officer nodded and handed him a pen. Evan signed the statement without looking back. Later, when Richard was escorted past us, he tried one last time. He leaned toward Evan and said quietly, You're choosing her over your blood. Evan met his gaze. No, he said. I'm choosing what's right. Richard had no answer for that. As the door closed behind him, I felt the weight lift. Not because justice was complete, but because the truth had finally been chosen out loud. That night, I realized something profound. Love isn't proven by loyalty to the past. It's proven by the courage to draw a line and refuse to cross it again. We didn't return to the reception hall. We didn't finish the cake or the dances or the speeches that had been carefully planned for months. The night ended quietly, not with music, but with signatures, reports, and a long drive home in borrowed clothes. In the weeks that followed, the story tried to reshape itself, softened versions, whispered excuses, suggestions that stress had caused everything. But the facts didn't bend. The footage existed, the statement existed, the truth was already written down. Evan and I moved into a small house on the other side of town. It wasn't impressive. It didn't come with history or expectations. It came with space to breathe. One night, sitting on the floor with takeout cartons between us, Evan said, I used to think marriage was about blending families. I shook my head gently. Sometimes it's about choosing which ones don't get access to you. He nodded, understanding, settling in his eyes. That was the real gift that came out of everything. Not revenge, not victory, but clarity. I learned that protecting yourself is not selfish. It is responsible. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It only protects the person with power. So, if there's one thing this story leaves behind, let it be this. Love should never require you to swallow danger. Boundaries are not betrayal. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them, document it, and choose yourself anyway. Our wedding didn't end the way I imagined. But our marriage began exactly the way it needed.